I remind you that yesterday was exactly 230 years since the taking of the Bastille, and I'll come to that at the end of my talk. Since Yoram and I published our essay, What is Conservatism, exactly 2 years ago, the one issue that raised probably the largest number of objections was our claim that the American Constitution isn't a Lockean liberal construct, but rather part of a traditionalist Anglo-American approach to politics. While some objected to the essence of our interpretation, more asked, what does it matter? These people argue that even if the Constitution is based on things like the 1628 Declaration of Rights and the 1688 Glorious Revolution, instead of ideas by Hobbes and Locke, by this point surely it doesn't matter. So why even touch on that? And I disagree, and I try to explain why with the help of Edmund Burke today. A Lockean interpretation of what the Constitution is based on arguing that the Constitution is based on a priori natural rights, leads to regarding the Constitution as merely a functional tool that is delivering those rights. This is a kind of, I call it a liberal originalism that slowly chips away at the authority of the Constitution itself by seeing it as only a tool. At first, the effect is minor, and it is hard even to see it. But eventually, certain interpretation opens the door for claims that we should do away with parts of the Constitution, perhaps eventually with all of it. This, I argue, is already happening today. On the left, we already have 4 Democratic senators introducing a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, because the Electoral College is simply some stuff remaining from the past that stops us from achieving our perfect Lockean rights. But similarly, on the right too, there are those who define themselves today as conservative liberals, who almost daily publish pieces in places like from the Bulwark to National Review, according to which the actual role of the Constitution is to create a framework for liberal democratic ideals to flourish. Now, the problem is not that there are people with such views. There always were. These were the ideas of Paine and Jefferson 230 years ago. The problem is that today, when I bring up this issue with Americans, many of them graduates of the most prestigious law schools in the country, the vast majority tend to agree with the idea that Locke was indeed the real founding father. And when I bring up Burke, who had another idea, I'm told that Burke really never got around to express any opinion about the US Constitution. In fact, although he did not touch that much on American affairs after 1788, he did, after 1783, Burke did say and write enough to make it clear that, one, he insisted that his positions on America and on Americans and the government were consistent throughout his career, both before and after the passing of the Constitution. He stressed that, like all good constitutions, the American one reflected national character and history, certainly not any abstract rights of man. And third, he claimed that, in fact, the US Constitution of 1787 was a version of the English Constitution, what today is called the British Constitution, which Americans adapted as well as they could to their circumstances. While the liberal understanding of the American Constitution as based on abstract Lockean principles epitomizes the Declaration of Independence, Burke regarded the American Constitution of 1787 as completing a process of restoration of the Anglo-American constitutional tradition in the US. already in one of his very first speeches in Parliament, a speech on declaratory resolutions delivered on 3rd February 1766, it was dealing with the right of the British government to tax the colonists. And Burke presented some of the principal ideas about America that he would uphold throughout his long career. So this is before the Constitution, before independence, before even the real struggle began. So among the many points Burke made in that speech, the most important for our purposes was that the distance of Britain from the colonies meant that they could never coalesce into one government with the mother country. It was impractical to actually think that you can govern a country in that way. And thus, Americans could not become an actual part of the working British Constitution. So he argued, as a result, we have nothing therefore for it but to let them carry across the ocean into the woods and deserts of America the images of the British Constitution. The penates is the Roman family god, like the image of the family gods. This is the Constitution of an Englishman, to be his comfort in his exile, and to be the pledge of his fidelity, and to give him an interest and dependency on this country, meaning on England. In essence, Burke was arguing that geographic realities mean that America could not become an integral part of the British government, and thus the English colonists would have, for the most part, to govern themselves. But this should be but they should do it, or would do it, by the images of the British Constitution, which they carried with them across the ocean to America. Now, I could bring many other examples from his career, but since we have time constraints, I'll get to 1791. By this point, America was independent, the Constitution had passed, and the French Revolution was well underway. At that point, Burke had not yet succeeded in swaying the British public opinion against the revolution. The terror and the execution of the king and the queen were still in the future. And the British government was suspicious but cautious, and many in the UK, including many of his own party, were still regarding the Constitution rather favorably. So the majority in Parliament were either favorable to the Constitution or only mildly critical of it. Only a handful were sharing the ferocity of Burke's opposition. Meanwhile, there was also a flurry of pamphlets published on the subject of events in France, with the vast majority of these pamphlets favoring the revolution, and many explicitly castigating Burke's reflections. Prominent among those was Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, which appeared in March 1791, and the book was dedicated to George Washington, and it had been written explicitly to rebut Burke's reflections. By the way, about a month later, Jefferson, now American Secretary of State, received the book and, of course, approved of it. In his chapter on constitutions, Paine commended the new American Constitution as a social contract arising from a clear slate of nature, built on reason and right. Contrasting this to his view of Britons, Paine sneered that no such thing as a constitution exists in England, but rather only moldy parchments from 1688, who cannot bind later generations. And moreover, the Bill of Rights is more properly a bill of wrongs and of insults. So the name of Paine's book, The Rights of Man, became an easy reference for the rationalist Lockean theories of those who supported the French Revolution. We have it in 1791 perfectly formed, this contrast between a view of the American Constitution as a kind of Lockean rights of man construct, and between a traditionalist view that, as you shall see, Burke held. between 6th and 8th of May 1791, there was a debate in the House of Commons on a bill for organizing the government of Quebec. It was the occasion for several of Burke's most important and, if often, overlooked speeches. Upon the beginning of the debate, Burke swiftly directed it towards a discussion of constitutional principles. He warned that such a discussion was necessary because a body of rights, commonly called the rights of man, imported from a neighboring country, France, had been lately set up by some persons in this country as paramount to all other rights. A principal article in this code was that all men are by nature free and equal in respect of rights and continue so in society. So this is the danger Burke is warning from. Having rejected this doctrine of rights of man, which was never preached anywhere without mischief, he proposed that Parliament give to the people of Canada the best government that their local situation and their connection to this country would admit. And finding such a government would be best served by looking at other relevant constitutions. And the great examples to be considered were the Constitution of America, of France, and of Great Britain. And now I'm quoting. To that of America, great attention, no doubt, was due, because it was of importance that the people of Canada should have nothing to envy in the constitution of a country so near to their own. Situation and circumstances were to first be considered. Now at this point, Burke presented his view of the then new US Constitution. I'm quoting a rather longish section, but it's important to quote it in full. The people of America had, he believed, formed a constitution as well adapted to their circumstances as they could. But compared with the French, they had a certain quality of phlegm, of old English good nature, that fitted them better for a republican government. They had also a republican education. Their former internal government was republican, and the principles and vices of it were restrained by the beneficence of an overruling monarchy in this country. The formation of their constitution was preceded by a long war, in the course of which, by military discipline, they had learned order, submission to command, and a regard for great men. They had learned what a king of Sparta had said was the great wisdom to be learned in his country, that is to command and to obey. They were trained to government by war, not by plots, murders, and assassination. In the next place, they had not the materials of monarchy or aristocracy among them. They did not, however, set up the absurdity that the nation should govern the nation, that Prince Prettyman should govern Prince Prettyman, but formed instead the government as nearly as they could according to the model of the British Constitution. Later in this speech, he even referred to the US Constitution as explicitly as an imitation of the British Constitution. So basically for Burke, the American Constitution was a version, with certain changes, of the British one. How could it be? How could a Republican Constitution be modeled after, indeed be an imitation of a monarchy? We must remember that to Burke and to many contemporaries, the English government was not a straight monarchy. It was a mixed constitution combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. They're counterbalancing each other, counterbalancing each other's defects, sorry. Indeed, he believed that Britain was essentially a republic engrafted upon the form of a monarchy. As for straightforward republics, Burke had often stressed that he was not a principled enemy of republics and believed that there were very many good ones. However, he did believe that the republican form of government, if the country did not have the materials of monarchy and aristocracy among them, was, so to say, constitutionally unstable. Meaning that since if a country did not have monarchy or aristocracy, you needed other elements to balance the natural tendency of republicanism. Because the natural tendency in republics was toward democracy, not what we call democracy, but wild democracy. This tendency had to be untamed, lest it run wild towards untested speculative theories of government, becoming one of plots, murders, and assassinations, like it had in France. Burke thus implied that even a republican constitution, simply adapted from the English one, would still suffer from unruly tendencies inherent to republican governments. However, Burke remarked, as we have seen in the quote before, on top of the English framework of the Constitution, the Americans of English heritage also possessed three peculiar features which counterbalanced the problematic republican proclivities. All three of these features were part of what we would call today, and he called also, national character. The first feature was also the oldest one, namely that by their manners and habits, the Americans were of old English good nature or phlegmatic. That is, by the temperament that they inherited from the English way of life, the Americans were naturally moderate and prudent in their public actions, unlike the hot-blooded and fanatical French. The second feature was one that the Americans had acquired in America, but it was also connected with their English heritage. This was that they had a republican education by the former internal governments of the colonies, which had been republican. However, the principles and vices of republican government were being restrained by the beneficence of an overruling monarchy. In other words, he believed that the fact that for 150 years these self-governing republics had been developing under the British monarchy meant that their self-rule was regulated, and in this way it became far more prudent and moderate, which then was came into the larger common government of the Americans. The third feature was the newest one, resulting from their long war of independence. The former colonists had learned order, submission to command, and a regular regard for great men, so that they were trained to government. In one word, he said that they had learned discipline. Thus, Americans restrained their more individualistic tendencies and followed the leadership of natural aristocrats, as he saw them, as he saw it. This is a point that Tocqueville also pointed at, but Tocqueville rightly said that with time, after one or two generations, this regard for great men and this thing that was learned by because of the Revolutionary War might dissipate to some degree. For Burke, these three peculiar features of American national character, mixing English heritage and local circumstances, crucially assisted the US in becoming a viable republic. Burke made it clear that he believed the colonists had fought the War of Independence as a defensive war. In the appeal from the new to the old Whigs, which appeared on the 3rd of August of the same year, 1791, Burke substantially addressed the American government, and in this work he again reiterated his opinion about the American war and the defensive character of the War of Independence. Indeed, he added that he always firmly believed that the Americans were purely on the defensive in that rebellion, and he considered the Americans as standing at that time in that controversy in the same relation to England as England did to James II in 1688. Thus, in effect, when we recall that the bulk of the appeal is devoted to prove that 1688 was not a Lockean radical new order, but rather a defensive restoration of the traditional English constitution, after James II had attempted to destroy it, we immediately see the parallel that Burke was drawing between the English Glorious Revolution and the American Constitution. He thus regarded America's War of Independence as their version of 1688, when purely on the defensive, and thus he regarded the Constitution as the completion of a process of restoration. To conclude, I hope that I convinced you that Burke, one, believed that the Americans had an established national character and political culture that were based to a great extent on English traditions. Second, that similarly to the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England, the Americans rebelled as an attempt to defend and restore these traditions. And three, that the 1787 American Constitution was the completion of this restoration. A government made as nearly as they could, I'm quoting, according to the model of the British Constitution. This view of the American Constitution, or some version of this view, was dominant on both sides of the Atlantic until more or less the 1930s. Even later, it was still an influential view, shared by many. However, during the last few decades, this interpretation of the American Constitution has virtually disappeared from view. Instead, many ideas of such as Paine or Jefferson regarding the Constitution as the result of abstract Lockean rights of man are now accepted even by most of those who describe themselves as conservatives. This interpretation has serious repercussions for our day, reaching far beyond the realm of historical inquiry. It is significant because it can help us to correctly interpret the spirit of the Constitution, as well as to oppose current attempts to change it in accordance with speculative liberal theories. Exactly 230 years ago today, people in London received a startling pling of news. It appeared that on the previous day, a mob of angry Frenchmen had stormed the Bastille and toppling one of the prominent symbols of the old regime. So the events in France have become a revolution. I think it's a good opportunity to think that this is exactly the danger that Burke was warning from when he opposed the revolution. And it is for this reason that it is imperative for us to restore the true account of the Constitution as following in the Anglo-American tradition. Otherwise, Burke assures us American Constitution too will succumb sooner or later to the wild radical theories of abstract rights of man. Thank you.